Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar event today, Sub-Antarctica and the Sub-Antarctic, the small stuff with Brent Sinclair. My name is Justin Peter, and I'm one of the owners at Worldwide Quest. We are a small travel company based in Toronto, and we specialize in small group experiential and educational travel on all 7 continents. And we're very pleased to welcome you to today's special event that we're in fact that touches on a tour that we're offering in the next year, which is our special expedition cruise to Antarctica, including the Falklands and South Georgia. That's the topic of the short video that you may have seen just a moment ago. And that is a tour that's being offered to all interested and curious travelers who like to visit the polar region of Antarctica and surrounding islands and would like to continue their love of lifelong learning. It's possible that you heard of today's event through us here at Worldwide Quest. This event was also promoted in partnership with a number of Canadian university alumni associations. And so it's possible you've heard about us through one of these fine associations here. We will be pleased to welcome you if you're interested in this expedition. We'll tell you a little bit more about the expedition later. As I mentioned, we travel around the world offering small group expeditions, and we're very pleased about today's event. Of course, our speaker today is going to be one of the featured study leaders drawn from the Canadian University alumni community, one of those participating schools I just showed you. And these are the dates of that expedition that our speaker Brent will be joining. And we had a wonderfully successful expedition for Canadian alumni a year ago, last year in late 2022, to the region. And so this expedition features these three study leaders, Philippe Tartel of University of British Columbia, Bruno Tremblay, who presented our webinar last week, or rather 2 weeks ago, from McGill, and today's speaker, Brent Sinclair from the University of Western Ontario. So, today, Brent will be presenting a session that is, let's say, a prelude to the series of presentations he's going to be giving on board with us. So you can consider this a bit of an introduction, a taster of the type of content we cover on one of our alumni expeditions tours, which are, of course, open to all interested travelers. I did want to mention one thing. You should be seeing slides across the bottom below my head here. If you see my face, but you don't see a slide, there is a gray bar below the box with my head with 3 little parallel horizontal lines. And if you click on that little box at center, that should pop the slide down for you. I did also want to mention that today's webinar event is being recorded, and the recording will be provided to all registrants. So you can expect that within a day of the end of this event. So if you'd like to view it again or to share this webinar recording with anyone else you think might be interested, you're more than welcome to do so. I should also mention you have a GoToWebinar console, which should be a vertical rectangle with a number of different tabs. One of them is called chat. So if you have any technical issues, if you wanted to enter what your issue is, in that chat, my colleague Vishwa, who's in the background here working on our technical support, can resolve those for you. It's also a place where we'll be dropping some links. We'll drop links to other events that are going on after our talk, as well as the expedition itself, if you want to learn a little bit more. As well, there is a questions tab. You'll see an arrow pointing to the right with questions, pointing at the word questions, and if you pop that, you click on that arrow, questions tab will pop out and down, and that's a place where following Brent's talk, formal talk, you can enter your questions, and we will have question and answer session following Brent's talk. So please look for that there as well. And And now I would like to move on to our talk with our speaker, Brent Sinclair. So we're very pleased to connect with Brent Sinclair for this expedition and for today's webinar, and pleased that he agreed to make some time now to share his area of interest. Brent is a professor of biology at Western University, and his research is on the physiology and ecology of insects and other arthropods in cold environments. And his interest has actually led him to spend more than a year of his life in the Antarctic and sub-Antarctic region. So he's actually lived in Antarctica, which I think is very interesting. Originally from New Zealand, Brent has published papers on everything from molecular physiology to global scale ecology. He served as the president of the Canadian Society of Zoologists and as the founding editor-in-chief of the scientific journal Current Research in Insect Science. Brent will be discussing the biology of cold-blooded Antarctic animals and their adaptations, and their prospects for persisting in a rapidly changing climate. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Brent today. There you are, Brent. We're looking forward to your talk.
Unmute, there we go. So thanks very much, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm from New Zealand, and growing up in New Zealand, where Antarctica is kind of in your face a lot. You kind of know people that go there and things like that. And so I've been visiting Antarctica. The first time I went was in 1997 at the age of 22, which I know 22-year-olds now, and it seems kind of crazy. And what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about the things that I'm excited about seeing when we're down there. And my background, my experience includes work in the sub-Antarctic, and this is Marion Island, but it's a very similar kind of flora and fauna to what you get on South Georgia and on some of the other sub-Antarctic islands. And these kinds of experiences are extraordinary. I was out catching caterpillars for my research this day, and these king penguins kind of trotted over several hundred meters to see what we were up to and kind of say hello. So this is really exciting, but it's not why I would be in Antarctica doing my research. The reason that I go to Antarctica to do research is to study the invertebrates that live there. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about those. So this is a map that if you're on this webinar, you've probably all seen before. We're starting out down here in Patagonia and heading to the Falklands, South Georgia, and then down to the Antarctic Peninsula here. And generally speaking, what people think about when they think about the Antarctic continent is all of this amazing marine life, the seabirds, the whales, the seals, and so forth. And it's easy to imagine that land kind of mostly looks like this, just like big expanses of ice. But if we look at a satellite image of Antarctica, if you kind of squint a little bit, you can see that there are all these like little bits of ice-free areas all around the edge of the continent and along down this edge of the Antarctic Peninsula as well. And those ice-free areas are home to a small number of species, but quite a rich, quite a biologically rich ecosystem of small arthropods and nematodes and other sorts of things. So here's a place that's very dear to my heart. This is in the Ross Sea region. This is a place called Cape Hallett, and at Cape Hallett, I spent 3 months of my life here, living in a tent about there, doing physiology from a tent, doing physiology from the tent. And sure enough, yes, there are penguins and skuas there. These are Adelie penguins. There was also one emperor penguin that cruised up to say hello. And there's South Polar skuas, which are really interesting animals, and the odd snow petrel that flies past. But if you look at this little area here, where there isn't a penguin colony, but instead there's meltwater from these snow patches and the glacier there, and we find this huge diversity of different creatures. We have mites, we have springtails, so these are both arthropods. I'll talk about those in a moment, and also rotifers, tardigrades, and nematodes, all these tiny little things living in the films of water around there. And these are the true Antarctic organisms. These are the things that have been in Antarctica for for 30 or 40 or 50 million years and have evolved to live in that environment. So just to introduce you to a couple of these guys that are similar to the ones that we will see on this expedition, these tiny little dots here are one of the larger terrestrial invertebrates in Antarctica. This is an orobatid mite, Mordheimia. Here it is zoomed in on a microscope. And these are small mites, they're hard-bodied, and there is a huge array of these species. There's a species on the Antarctic Peninsula that's very abundant, and I'll talk about that in a moment. There's also orobatid mites right up in Nunatak sticking out of the polar ice cap and all sorts of other interesting places like that. And then the other group of species that I'm particularly interested in are these springtails. So springtails are almost insects. They're hexapods, they have 6 legs, but they don't have wings, they don't have a metamorphosis, so they don't, or at least my colleagues don't count them really as insects. And they're quite extraordinary little creatures. If you have spent any time in the forest in the winter in Canada, you may have come across snow fleas, and they're related to these guys. This is Desauria clovestadi. So one of the things that's really interesting about these is how they survive in the environment, and that's what my research is about. And spoiler alert, Antarctica is pretty cold. So this is my colleague Jaco Klock coming into the tent and during a blizzard when we were down there at Cape Hallett. And the thing is that these invertebrates are ectotherms, so they're at risk of freezing. They can't regulate their body temperature in the way that birds and mammals can. So when the temperature drops, so does their body temperature. Now, in somewhere like Antarctica, where it might get to minus 50 degrees C over the winter, that means that they actually run the risk of their body fluids freezing. Now, there's 2 main ways that they deal with this. So one is to actually withstand internal ice formation. And a very famous Antarctic species that does this is this guy here, Belgica antarctica. These are the Antarctic midge. They're the only true insect that lives in the Antarctic continent. So these are, the equivalent of your elephants on the savannah or whatever. They're absolutely enormous at 3 or 4 millimeters long. And another one that we probably won't get to see because they're kind of hard to track down and they're kind of hard to extract and they're invisible is these nematodes. And this is the species that got me into working in Antarctica because it's a species that my PhD advisor worked on for his entire career. And these nematodes can actually survive ice forming inside their cells. The flip side of this cold tolerance coin is simply to avoid freezing at all. So we call these animals freeze avoidant, and they prevent internal ice formation. And springtails and mites that I've just been talking about are just about the epitome of using this strategy. So this is a springtail called Gomphocephalus hodgsoni, and it's the southernmost springtail in the world. It's found down at the bottom of the Ross Sea region. And these guys in the winter can survive temperatures below minus 50. And they do this by accumulating very large amounts of antifreezes in their hemolymph, in their blood, and that prevents ice formation. The other thing that I will talk about and that we won't necessarily get to see are Antarctic fishes, which also use this freeze avoidance strategy. Now, as a terrestrial invertebrate person, I will tell you that the fishes are not that impressive. The water temperature in Antarctica is always minus 1.86 degrees C, so they don't really have much to deal with, except that their body fluids tend to freeze at about minus 1.2 degrees C, so they still have a good chance of freezing. And so what these fishes do is they actually use antifreeze proteins, which you may have heard of. And this is this family of things that has evolved and has allowed the Antarctic fishes to expand enormously. This is at Terranova Bay near the Italian station, Mario Zucchelli station. And this is 100% of the fish that I have caught as an adult. And so this is a little bit of a taster of the kinds of things that I will talk about in terms of the biology of Antarctica. Justin and his crew will be able to tell you everything you need to know about penguins and seals and marine mammals. And the special sauce that I will bring is being able to talk about some of these other creatures you may not know as much about, the giant Antarctic sea spiders and huge isopods and the things that live inside the brine channels inside the ice, and of course my beloved springtails and mites. So the thing that so I was going to finish this by talking about some of the things that I think we should see on this meeting, or on this meeting, on this cruise that particularly excite me. And this is because so much of the Antarctic, the work with our understanding of how insects and mites survive low temperatures comes from work on around the Antarctic Peninsula. So I've called these the little five. These are the fun creatures that I'm hoping we'll get to see. So I've already mentioned Belgica antarctica, the Antarctic midge. It's the largest insect on the continent. It's the only true insect on the continent. It's the only fly in Antarctica. The larvae are the stage that are freeze tolerant, and we should find these if we look under rocks in some of the penguin colonies. And I think we'll be a little bit early in the season to see the adults, but the adults are these tiny little wingless midges. Cue dad joke, what do you call a fly without wings? It's a walk. So we have these like little walks that give rise to the larvae. So Belgica antarctica, I'm excited to see that if we're able to get on shore on the peninsula. Another thing that we'll see there when we look under rocks, especially around moss, is Elascozetes antarcticus. That's one of these orobatid mites. And Elascozetes is super exciting. They're freeze avoidant, they're very abundant, and they're very, very good at surviving in Antarctic conditions. They're very resistant to dehydrating and all sorts of other environmental insults. There's not that many. In fact, there is exactly one springtail that has ever achieved international fame by being on a postage stamp, and that's this one here, Cryptopygus antarcticus. So Cryptopygus antarcticus we'll see again. We'll see again on the peninsula, and this is a creature that's a small springtail. We'll find it around the moss. At that time of year, if it's a sunny day, we may even see them crawling across the surface of the moss. They're active at very, very low temperatures. And Cryptopygus is probably the species that has been studied, the species of springtail that's been studied most in the entire world. It's so famous it's on a postage stamp, so we get to see a real celebrity while we're down there. Something that is going to be harder to see, but I think is academically really interesting, is this mite here, Nanorchestes antarcticus. So this is a fabulous photo of Nanorchestes, and the reason is that Nanorchestes is literally microscopic. They are another species. They're another species of mite, and they are smaller than a piece of punctuation on your page. And the reason that these guys are academically interesting is that they are everywhere in Antarctica. Just about all of their ice-free areas have Nanorchestes there, but they are also the southernmost animal in the world. So these have been found living their lives quite happily on the southernmost piece of rock that sticks up above the Antarctic ice sheet at about 83 degrees south. So that's an academically exciting creature to see. Unless something gets really interesting, we're not going to be down at 83 degrees south, but we will be able to see Nanorchestes, which is a species that does live down there. And then the final species, back to South Georgia, where Justin began proceedings, is this species on South Georgia, Perimylops antarcticus. And Perimylops is a beetle. This is a beetle larva, and the larvae are again freeze tolerant. And the neat thing about them is that they are they're freeze tolerant, and they're dependent on their environment for initiating freezing as well. So they need to be in these moist kinds of places, and when that happens, they can survive internal ice formation. They're a little bit bigger, and they're another sort of famous species that some of my mentors studied, back in the 1980s and early 90s. So I'm very excited to meet those as well. Okay, so I hope that you will be excited to see these creatures too, and I'm happy to answer questions about them, and also maybe a little bit about my other Antarctic experience, or maybe even about penguins and other seabirds, because I've seen my share of those as well. So thank you very much.
Great, Brent. Well, that's a nice introduction to some of the big wildlife. You call them the little five in Antarctica, but I guess if they're the only real terrestrial animals, if we don't count the penguins so much, if we count them as, if we look at permanent residents of Antarctica, as these invertebrates are, as opposed to the penguins, which are seasonal, we may as well call them the big five or the
They
big
are.
six or such.
Yep, the two that I haven't mentioned because they're things that we're not going to be allowed to go and see are there's a flea that spends its winter in snow petrel nests, and
Oh,
there's
yes.
also there's a tick that is on some of the penguins and can spend its winter down there as well. But we're probably not going to be delving our way through nests on this trip, so you'll just have to take my word that they exist.
That's funny. Now, can you tell me, we'll be taking some, actually, I see we are getting some questions now from our audience. So if you just to let everyone know, all the attendees, that you can ask your questions in the questions tab. And I'm just going to make sure I'm fielding them to you. What's the one thing that always amazes you when you think about these big five or all of these permanent residents of Antarctica?
Yeah, so obviously winter is a big story because it gets really cold. But I think the other thing that we sometimes don't I sometimes don't think about as much, but as the time that I'm seeing them, is that it's really it's a very short growing season. They really have to work to get through their life cycle during this short summer. So they have to be active at much lower temperatures than most organisms are. They have to be reproducing at those temperatures. In the case of the midges, they only survive as larvae, so they have to close as adults, run around, find a mate, lay eggs, and those eggs have to hatch and the larva has to grow a bit so that they can survive the following winter. In the case of the springtails, these tiny little creatures, they probably live for 3, 4, 5 or more years to get through their life cycle. It takes that long because it's such a harsh environment. So I love what they do in winter, but it's just as important to remember the cool things that are going on during the growing season as well, and how hard that is.
Interesting. Now we have some great questions here from our attendees. Lindsay is asking, what do the midges eat, both the adults and the larvae?
Yeah, stuff. So they eat, they live in the kind of the goo around penguin colonies. It's not the nicest place to live. So some combination of leftover penguin poo and the algae growing in it, and maybe some of the cyanobacterial mats and things like that. So they're not quite omnivorous, but they're kind of chewing away on the stuff that they find there. They're kind of moderately gross maggots, I guess. The adults don't feed at all. They have a very, very limited time. They get out there, they do their business, they lay their eggs, and then they die.
Interesting. We have one question here. Having been to, you've been to South Georgia, of course, I believe you.
I have not.
Oh, you've not been to South Georgia,
no,
but you've been in other sub-Antarctic regions.
Yeah, all my
yes,
sub-Antarctic stuff is around on the other side with the South African program and the New Zealand program.
Good.
Yeah.
But I suppose the ecosystems are similar. I mean, you do have king penguins there and other species. It's really at the border of the Southern Ocean.
Yes.
So could we expect conditions would be similar then?
Yeah, I think so. So South Georgia is south of the Antarctic convergence, as is Marion Island. And once you get south of the Antarctic convergence, you get a very different set of species. So the vegetation is lower. That you don't get. So if you go north of the Antarctic convergence to say Campbell Island, south of New Zealand, you get these kind of giant megaherbs and all sorts of cool things like that. That all sort of disappears. And the temperatures are both cooler on average and more stable. So it doesn't get very warm in the summer. And on an island like South Georgia, but unless you go up in the hills, it doesn't get that cold during the winter either. So we get these kind of so it becomes this very kind of it can freeze at any time of year, it can rain at any time of year, you can get snow, you can get warmish sunshine, and so the habitat all around there is very similar. And one of the reasons that it's similar is because the Antarctic convergence isolates Antarctica biogeographically, I guess. So we get this kind of west wind drift where most of the things in Antarctica are circulating around either in the air or on ocean currents, and it's very hard if you're, unless you're swimming under your own power, to get across that in one direction or another. So what we find is that many of the species that we find on Marion Island, we will find on Kerguelen Island and Amsterdam Island, and as we go sort of around the Indian Ocean, and then right through to South Georgia. So there's lots of shared things, and if they're not the same species, they're often the same genus.
All right. So, of course, on this expedition, we're visiting Falkland Islands first, after departing South America, Falklands being north of the Antarctic convergence, and then we're crossing the Antarctic convergence over to South Georgia before going down to Antarctica proper. So then we expect whatever we might find in the microfauna will be quite different between the Falkland Islands and South Georgia for those many
Absolutely.
reasons.
Yeah, so the Falklands is going to be much more diverse. There's many, many more species, and as you go further south, you get fewer and fewer species until all you're left with is a small mite that's smaller than a piece of punctuation. But the Falklands it's remote, it's an island, so you have all of these island things going on. There's going to be flightless insects and things like that. But it's much more influenced by South America, and so it's kind of a bit of a Patagonian fauna that's just kind of adapted to living in the Falklands. South Georgia, we've got things that have been there for a long time with a little bit of influence from further north, and then as we get further south, by the time we reach the actual continent proper, most of the things there have been along for the whole Antarctic ride. So the springtails and mites haven't moved in later. They were there when Antarctica was isolated and glaciated.
Interesting. Now, Mo is asking. I think you talked about one of the groups or what they eat. Mo's asking just generally what do they eat? Do we find or I mean, you mentioned it, but will you find a diversity of different unrelated species of invertebrates in a penguin colony, for example? And would you expect the greatest diversity where you have those resource inputs, where you have that food available?
Yeah, it comes and goes. I think in general, and people that come that have not yet been to a penguin colony, you kind of have to prepare your nostrils because it's a very, very intense olfactory experience. And in many cases, those direct habitats that are directly influenced by the penguins, where you get build up of sometimes meters of guano, it's just too rich, it's too full of ions, it's too full of like all sorts of nasty things for really much to live at all. So there are some algae that live there, and there are some nematodes that live there, but it's really around the periphery where you start getting moss growth and lichen growth and things that you see more of these things. The midges are an exception because they do seem to do pretty well in this kind of gunge in under the rocks and things. But they're kind of a little bit around the edge. And we saw that at Cape Hallett, for example. So I sort of showed where the birds were on this place called CB Hook, where there used to be an Antarctic station. And that's where the penguins are. And there we find really just nematodes. But if we go to the place that for no really adequately explored reason, there's this gravel beach that doesn't have penguins on it, and that is where all of our diversity is. And in fact, that particular beach has the highest invertebrate diversity of anywhere south of the Antarctic Peninsula.
Very interesting. Now I have some more questions coming in. Derek is asking, are the adult midges and beetles ice tolerant as well? You talked about the larval beetles. Are the adults ice tolerant too?
So the adult beetles, I believe they survive freezing. The adult midges are not. So the adult midges, they have this very brief period as an adult, and they have to get into the right life stage to be able to survive. Well, not just the winter, the summer half the time as well, because it gets pretty cold in the summer as well sometimes. So you can get freeze-thaw cycles and things. And we see this in quite a lot of species. And if people are in the kind of in Ontario, you'll be familiar with goldenrod and the galls that you got on goldenrod. And so that inside those galls, there's a fly larva, a maggot, and that has to overwinter as the final instar maggot. It can't overwinter earlier on in its life cycle, and it can't overwinter as an adult. That it's been adapted to just specifically overwinter in this life cycle. The mites and springtails that have these long life cycles, as long as they're not an egg, they seem to be fine.
Okay, interesting. I have a question here. Helen's asking an interesting question because, of course, you work on freeze-tolerant invertebrates. That's, of course, not a habitat that's limited to Antarctica. Helen is asking, would the same little five occur in the Arctic, or are they only in Antarctica?
Oh, the Arctic is wild. So because the Arctic is more or less contiguous with further south here, there isn't that massive biogeographic barrier that prevents stuff from moving up. So I can go and work at a similar latitude in the Arctic, and it's really convenient in the Arctic because there are communities there. You can just get a commercial flight, and because I'm working on invertebrates, not on anything big and complicated, you can literally just like walk to the lawn outside your hotel, and you can find all the springtails and spiders and things you need. But because it's contiguous with the lower latitudes, there's been so much more that's moved in there. So where at say 77 degrees south, I'm quite proud of the fact that I could identify every single animal from nematodes to whales that we saw at the site. And I'm a terrible taxonomist, so that is by virtue of there being fewer than 20 in total. If I go to the Arctic to the same latitude, there are going to be probably 10 or 12 species just of spiders, and so we don't even get spiders in the Antarctic, or in the Antarctic proper. We will on the Falklands, I think. And so in terms of springtails, we've recorded, I think, a total of 32 species of springtails from the Antarctic continent, and I think something like 120 species from Cambridge Bay. So the diversity is completely different, and also having these predators is very different as well. There's a couple of, I should have added it to my little five as the big predator of the area, which is there's a predatory mite in some of these areas, which goes around and kind of very occasionally you sort of find one kind of chowing down on an unsuspecting springtail.
Interesting, very interesting. I have another question. I'm not sure if my camera is frozen here or
I think
not.
you have, yeah.
I might have frozen. I'll try and rectify that, but I think you can still hear me. A question from Leslie. Do you work on tardigrades as well?
I do not for the most part, although the community of people that work on environmental tolerances of invertebrates is fairly small. So, I've kind of always known people that do. And actually, strangely enough, one of my former PhD students, a Western alum, Caroline Williams, who's now at Berkeley, one of her first PhD students to graduate actually did her PhD on tardigrade cold tolerance. But in the really boring way, because tardigrades are famous for being tolerant of everything. And she was actually working on showing that actually most tardigrades are not really very tolerant of anything. And it's just that we grab these like couple of species that are exceptional, the ones that we find in Antarctica, and pay attention to those. Then most of them just kind of aren't very good at that at all. So even though tardigrades are famous for being awesome, the tardigrades that are in Antarctica are particularly awesome compared to most tardigrades.
Interesting, very interesting. I have a few questions remaining here. We will get to all the questions. If you've asked one, we will get to all of them. Lindsay is asking, who do these invertebrates feed? What are they food for?
That's a good question. And I think the answer is no one really. So there aren't any, so certainly, so when we go to the sub-Antarctic, then we have kind of the only terrestrial bird that we'll come across, the paddy, the sheathbill, and they are definitely pulling out invertebrates and things from the vegetation. And I've seen that. I've seen them pulling out caterpillars and things on Marion Island. They'll probably also grab the odd weevil or beetle or whatever else crosses their path. Once we get to Antarctica, there's nothing really that is eating these other than a very small number of predators. So there are, I think on the peninsula, there is a nematode predator that is a predator of tardigrade eggs. And there is, as I said, there's a predatory mite that will eat some of the springtails and some of the mite eggs. But otherwise, it's kind of a free-for-all. You don't have to worry about anything if you're a midge in Antarctica, rather than it being really challenging environmental conditions and being up to your neck all the time in penguin poo.
Interesting. So you're sort of the top dog. Uh, you level off. There's one layer, perhaps one layer. Maybe your eggs will be prey to another invertebrate, but you are the one and only, perhaps.
Absolutely. And if we contrast that again with the Arctic, right, we have, springtails eating algae and fungi, for example, and they're being eaten by small spiders, which might be being eaten by bigger spiders, which are being eaten by waders. And suddenly those waders are, and if there were marine sourced nutrients going into those algae because they're by the coast or near a seabird colony or something, then suddenly those waders are at the same trophic level as, killer whales. Whereas here we just have this flat system. Everyone's just making a go of it. One weird thing about the nematodes is that they are eating mostly bacteria, and the bacteria are subsisting on the stuff that they can grow. And around penguin colonies and things, it's very obvious where those nutrients are coming from. They're coming from the penguins. But in the dry valleys and on the Ross Sea side of Antarctica, this is an area where there are these big empty valleys with lakes at the bottom, and there's no penguins there. Well, they get like a penguin there every like 3 or 4 years that took a wrong turn and sort of will literally just wander up to someone's camp and say, "Hello, can I join in?" And they'll say, "No," and they'll call a vet and they'll put them in a box and take them back to the sea. But these nematodes are actually eating bacteria eating the dried up remains of the lake bed or the seafloor when it was much deeper. So they're eating potentially 12 or 15 or 20,000 year old carbon as their main energy source, and they call that legacy carbon. So the strange thing is that I think that if you try and carbon date a nematode from the dry valleys, you get some very, very strange numbers because it's eating this very, very strange mix of carbon isotopes.
Ancient carbon. Interesting, very interesting. One question here, which is very, very appropriate because of course, you've introduced us to some of the cold tolerant, freeze tolerant invertebrates. Of course, we have the theme of climate change and the prospect that some of these very cold places to which these invertebrates have adapted are going to warm. So the question then is, how do they adapt to that? Is it actually maybe good for them, or it's sort of neutral and they adapt? But the specific question is, since you have been to some of the sub-Antarctic islands on various occasions, previously, having returned to those islands, have you personally witnessed the impact of climate change? For example, a shift in the organisms that you're seeing, or where they can live, where they are, or where they've come to live over time. Are you able to do that? Is anyone surveying this?
Yeah, so I have not seen those changes. When we were at Cape Hallett, there had been a group of people in the 1950s that had done a survey there, and we tried to recreate the transect that they measured sort of springtail abundance and things across. And the thing that was interesting there was that the distribution seemed to be pretty much the same, to the extent that there was only one place at the site where we found those orobatid mites. And when I looked up the kind of the field notes and things that I could find from this expedition from the 50s, we think we were looking pretty much under the same like half dozen rocks and finding this population. So what that tells us is that the invertebrate distribution doesn't change very much at all. So I think that as things change, we will see very big shifts, and we're still kind of grappling with understanding what those will look like. And so, for example, with Cape Hallett, one of the things that struck me when I was there was that there was this big snow patch behind us, behind our camp. And I could look at these photos from the 50s and 60s, and it looked more or less the same. And a couple of weeks ago, I was hunting around for some pictures to go with this, and I was looking on some archives from Antarctica, New Zealand, and I was looking at some recent photos of that area, and that snow patch has suddenly changed shape. So I think that we're starting to see these threshold shifts where we get bigger differences than we were getting in the past. So that's kind of something that I think is starting to happen. The biggest challenge, I think, or one of the big challenges in this part of in the Antarctic Peninsula and the sub-Antarctic is going to be invasive species. That's the biggest piece of anthropogenic change that is a real worry right now. And we're at this interesting stage where we have actually been able to address like climate change in almost real time on a couple of occasions. So on Marion Island, for example, there was an isopod, so a woodlouse that was introduced, and they found it on this like one beach, and then over the course of 4 or 5 years, systematically managed to eradicate it before it spread across to the rest of the island. On the other hand, there are also species of springtails that have gotten there, and they probably got there in ship's ballast and all sorts of things like that. That that door is open. South Georgia is a great example of invasive species being controlled. So I think that they did hunt the reindeer out, right, Justin? I don't think there's no reindeer there anymore.
I saw only on my last visit just skeletal remains of
Yeah,
reindeer.
so I think they eradicated the reindeer, and I believe they've also now eradicated rats from the island. So that means that they're starting to restore the ecosystem. So what that does is it means that at least these systems are a little bit more resilient because we're reducing one of the pressures. So that gives them a better chance of surviving the face of climate change. In the Antarctic continent proper, the biggest challenge that these organisms have with these little things is they don't disperse very well. There's no wings on a springtail. It's not going very well. We think that they do disperse aerially, at least a little bit, and also by rafting on the surface of water. But that's not, you're not getting kind of, large scale migration that way. And so what we don't know is how we're going to see these fragmented populations respond in the very fast time frame of climate change. And we're sort of still working on understanding how to think about that. Here's a fun fact for you though, Justin.
All right.
If you fly in a plane at, 25,000 feet from South America to Antarctica, and you tow an insect net, what do you reckon you'd catch?
Not a lot. I don't think you would catch a lot. I don't know.
You would catch, and this always fries my brain, you would catch spiders and you would catch caterpillars.
Interesting, very interesting.
Because these are things that use little strands of silk to balloon. Sometimes they get so far up into the atmosphere that they get kind of blown around and can get into all sorts of strange places. And so that's one source of potential invasive species going forward, and particularly in the sub-Antarctic.
Interesting. Very appropriate, because Derek is asking a question about caterpillars. You mentioned caterpillars in the Falklands, and actually I don't know the answer to this question offhand. Perhaps you do. Will there be adults of these caterpillars, as moths or butterflies, out during the expedition dates? So we're talking, we'll be in the Falklands at the end of October, which is spring. I don't know. I don't recall seeing butterflies or moths.
I'm not sure who's on the Falklands, but for Pringleophaga, the caterpillar that I've worked on in the sub-Antarctic, and I think there's a similar kind of thing on South Georgia. I think it's too early in the summer. Again, they don't overwinter as adults, and most of the work that we did, if we ever did work on adult moths, we were finding them in April or May. So at the end of the summer, so it's kind of an end of summer kind of situation. The midges, I think we might catch. I think they come out relatively early, but I think again we're going to be a little bit early for that. I think that's more of a that's more of a Christmas thing. It's what Antarctic people put on their Christmas cards, is the Antarctic, the traditional Christmas midge.
Great, very interesting. I have two questions here. One from Robert. Robert is asking, do these critters bite humans? And if they do, is there any risk of transmitting pathogens such as viruses?
No, they don't bite humans. You could probably get a nibble out of a beetle larva if you really kind of tried, but I doubt it would be able to break the skin. Um, None of the other things are in a position to bite humans at all. I think the most horrible things I've heard about is people I know that work on seals in Antarctica, and inevitably they have stories of people getting horrible bites that never heal because of all the bacteria and things. But no. Having said that, though, in terms of viruses and things like that, I remember when I was a grad student, there were people in Antarctica starting to dig into the permafrost beneath their penguin colonies to try to reconstruct past flu viruses, because birds are very good at carrying flu. So, as we get melting in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, I think we're certainly there is going to be some zoonosis of various sorts. I don't think it will be from things being bitten here. I mean, Justin's been to the Arctic as well. There are certainly things that will bite you in the Arctic, but again, I don't think they carry disease. Most of the things that are spread, most of the wildlife diseases that are spread in the Arctic tend to be spread by things that are kind of in the vegetation and that are consumed, rather than they're sort of parasites that way, rather than things that are transmitted by the biting insects. I think. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I believe that's so.
Doesn't
Derek
make
is
it any better being bitten by them.
we don't want to be bitten ever. That's right. Derek is asking a question which I can answer. Derek is asking, will there be opportunities to see marine arthropods on the expedition? You're thinking about krill, but are there also others? I think we have a good chance of seeing krill at some point. We will certainly see the leftovers of krill in penguin colonies. As the penguins come back, they may regurgitate bits of krill, but we may actually see it in the water. What we might actually see on the microscopic scale is some bacteria and other items. We'll be doing some water samples, taking some water samples, and our other study leader, Philippe Chautel of UBC, I think my camera has frozen, will be discussing and interpreting them along with his wife, who's also faculty at University of British Columbia, Maria Maldonado. She specializes in these critters, and we'll be discussing, and we should be seeing some of that marine microscopic life, so you can look forward to that.
Yeah, and of course we're coming to shore on boats and landing on the shore as well, and there is actually quite a lot of marine intertidal life, especially in the sub-Antarctic. But even on the Antarctic Peninsula, there is an intertidal limpet. It's the only really the only intertidal organism in Antarctica, because stuff mostly just gets kind of ground off by the ice. But there is a limpet that if it's a low tide, we might be able to kind of see cruising around that just at the edge there. So there might be, bring your rubber boots, and there might be an opportunity to splash around in the water a tiny bit and look under our feet, and we might see some things.
Yes, in fact, we will have rubber boots provided to us on board our vessel, the Magellan Explorer, so that's very appropriate. And I had not thought about limpets previously on a previous trip, so we'll definitely be attuned to those.
And the other thing that we could think about, Justin, and this just occurred to me now, so sorry about throwing it at you now, is take a GoPro and drop it on a pole under the boat as we're getting into shore, and see what we see along in the subsurface environment along there.
Yes, excellent. Well, I think those are all the questions we have remaining. Looks like my camera's frozen again, but I do want to mention, of course, the expedition we've been referring to next year is the Epic Antarctica with the Falklands and South Georgia expedition aboard the Magellan Explorer, a ship that we have come to love. We're visiting the Falklands, two sub-Antarctic regions, the Falklands above the Antarctic convergence, the magnificent South Georgia below, and then Antarctica proper. And our study leaders, including Brent, will be giving us a series of presentations that are that build on each other and give us the full context for these sub-Antarctic and Antarctic region. So we can continue many discussions, and I'm sure Brent will have much more to say about his past experiences in Antarctica, as well as some of the things we're expecting to see and we're seeing, and we might have the chance to look at some of those invertebrates ourselves when we're there. So I welcome you to consider that. This event today is part of a series of presentations by our study leaders and our Worldwide Quest naturalists in the chat box. If you're still in attendance here, please have a look. We've put the link to the upcoming 2 events that we have scheduled so far. On Tuesday the 9th, we have an event with Mark Weber, who is our marine mammals expert. He's an author also of Marine Mammals of the World. That'll be Tuesday, January 9th. You'll see that on that link if you click to it, as well as penguins, the world's ultimate predators. Our ornithologist, Catherine Jardine, will be discussing penguins on Tuesday, January 16th. So you can find both of those webinar registration links in the link right now in your chat box. We'll also send that to you, as well as the recording to today's event. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we hope to see you at a future webinar event. Thank you so much.